Okay, I think I figured out what was going on. I'd overloaded the memory card, and now I've cleared it all out, so we have more space, and hopefully this is going to work. Okay, so I was telling you that Teddy Roosevelt comes to the year 1808. He's at the end of what was almost the second term of his presidency, had to make a critical decision about whether or not he would run for president again. There had never been a more than two-term president that was the precedent that was established by George Washington, and no one broke it. And Teddy Roosevelt had not really had two full terms. He'd had 3 years of McKinley's term and 4 years of his own. He was still young. I think he was only 49 years of age. He was incredibly popular among the American people. It was a given that he would be reelected if he ran for president at that particular moment. And so, but this was what he was having to kind of confront, and the decisions he was going to have to try to make. Anyway, he decided not to run for president anymore, but to show you how incredibly popular he was, he could pretty much handpick his own successor, and he chose his friend and vice president, a man by the name of William Howard Taft. Now, I describe William Howard Taft as, at least in terms of this story, sorry about where my finger is, I call it the Taftian interlude. The concept of the interlude is something that has to do with like symphonic music. So you have movements within the symphony, so there's like lots of action, lots of music and everything. I'm not an expert in this field, so just kind of take this all with a grain of salt. But then you'll have like one big movement, and then it gets really quiet in between, and then you have a second really big movement. I was at a symphony one time, and I really didn't understand the dynamics of what was going on. So there was the first big section of music, and it goes on for, 20 minutes, and then it got really quiet. And I just started clapping because I thought it was over. And I got all these dirty looks from the people around me who were saying, no, it's not over yet. And so that was the interlude. One big movement of music and quiet interlude, and then another one. So it's called the Taftian interlude because he's the quiet time between the major activities of the two major progressive presidents. Now, Taft is not going to be a great progressive, but there are special things about him that I want to highlight for you guys, and forgive me for telling you this part of the story, but I kind of have to. So Taft was the somethingest president in the United States, all right? So what I mean by this is that the tallest president in American history was Abraham Lincoln at 6'4". The shortest president in American history was James Madison at 5'2". And Taft was neither the tallest nor the shortest, but he was the somethingest. And the somethingest that he was, of course, was the fattest president in American history. And indeed, William Howard Taft was so fat, and of course I need you guys to be saying, how fat was he? He was so fat that when he sat around the White House, he sat around the White House. And when he fell through the Republican Party platform, it took all 9 Supreme Court justices to swear him in. They had to iron his clothes in the driveway, on the driveway. These were all jokes, actually, at that particular time. But here's not a joke, a true story, and that was that William Howard Taft actually got stuck in the White House bathtub. I guess his bottom was so significant that it created some kind of suction situation, and they had to bring the Secret Service in to kind of help him to get out of that particular predicament. And of course, it was humiliating, and he didn't want that to happen again, so they built an extra large bathtub for William Howard Taft as far as the White House was concerned. Taft is not a bad guy. He simply did not have that progressive dynamic within him. He did complete the trust busting. He did expand the national force, but he really just didn't have that same kind of fervor that Roosevelt had, basically. And so we see the kind of momentum of the progressive era beginning to really fade under the Taft administration. Now, Roosevelt played this moment really interestingly. He realized that if he stayed in America while Taft was struggling, or not struggling actually, while Taft was having his presidency, then everyone would second guess what Taft was doing, and they'd always look to Roosevelt. So Roosevelt kind of kindly decided that he would vacate the premises. And one thing that he did during this time was he went to Africa on this incredible safari activity. And I have to tell you that, I've read this and it just seems almost impossible to believe, but they say that he actually brought home from Africa over 3,000 animal trophies. So that means that he killed probably more than 3,000 animals and then would have them mounted. Roosevelt was one of those guys who just loved to have dead animals in his decorating, so all around the White House there would be mooses and deer and that kind of thing. He had killed a big grizzly bear upon one hunting occasion, and he had it stuffed so that it was standing, a standing grizzly bear that was probably 8 feet tall or something like that. And indeed, he put that in the West Room, and he would bring people in, to see it. He'd be standing there with kind of grizzly behind him. He's like, "You messing with me, you messing with Grizz," Anyway, Roosevelt loved to kill animals, and he killed, I wonder how many he killed over the course of his lifetime. But anyway, Roosevelt's idea was to stay out of the mix so that Taft would have his own presidency and they wouldn't be second guessing him. Anyway, he ultimately did have to come home, and he comes back to the United States of America, and he sees that Taft has not continued the progressive dynamics, and he's unhappy with this. So in 1912, he makes the incredible decision that he's going to run for president again. And in this case, he's going to run against an incumbent. And the incumbent is his friend and former colleague, William Howard Taft. And you can imagine how devastating that was for Taft, essentially. So, here comes Roosevelt, and there are rules of politics in America, and one essential rule of politics in America is that if you're of a party of the party of the president, you do not run against the president. Well, you don't run against the incumbent. So that's an essential rule, and Roosevelt is violating this basic rule by running against the incumbent. Well, it all very controversial. It all goes to the Republican National Convention. You have two prominent kind of candidates coming forward, of course, the incumbent William Howard Taft, and you also have the challenger, Teddy Roosevelt, who was extremely popular, to say the least. And so they had to consider, the Republican Party had to figure out, what are we going to do about this? And as I've already told you, the rule of party is that you stick with the incumbent. And therefore, the convention decided that they would keep with William Howard Taft. Well, Roosevelt was unwilling to accept this. He just walks out with a huge delegation out of the convention, and kind of in the street outside of the hall, he proclaims his own independent candidacy. He's going to run for president on his own. He created what he called the Progressive Party, a third-party candidate. It was also sometimes known as the Bull Moose Party. And the objective was, of course, to run as an independent and become president of the United States. Now, there are many rules of American politics, but one critical rule is that when one party splits itself between two candidates, and in this case, of course, it was Taft and Roosevelt, then the election will probably fall to the opposing candidate. A party splits itself. And if you look what happened, in the election of 1912, if you look at the total for Roosevelt and Taft, it was greater than the Democratic candidate. But because of the plurality, they split the vote, and by the way, Roosevelt did poll higher numbers than Taft, so he shows his continuing popularity. But in the election of 1812, the Republicans basically commit suicide, essentially, and they hand the presidency over to the Republican candidate, and that person is Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson would become the second of the great progressive presidents of the progressive era. Wilson's an interesting individual. He's very different, and he's very different than Teddy Roosevelt. You never would have called him Woody Wilson or something like that. Much more kind of a stern, sort of school marmish kind of individual, but a very prominent. And he was the second of the great progressive presidents, and very important in American history. There are things I'd like to tell you about. I'm not going to do quite as much with Wilson as I did with Roosevelt, but things I'd like to give you some sense of his character. Woodrow Wilson is intriguing to me in that he is the only president who not only would you call him Mr. President, but you could call him Dr. President, because he's the only true academic ever to be president of the United States. He had a PhD, and it was in history and international politics. He actually got his PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He became a professor at Princeton University, a professor of history and international politics, and ultimately became the president of Princeton University. And I have to tell you, it's kind of intriguing to see, how would this academic become president of the United States? And it very much is like an indication of the progressive era. Princeton is in New Jersey. New Jersey was a Democratic-dominated state, but it had a real powerful and corrupt machine, and the machine was trying to clean up its act as best they possibly could. So they go to Woodrow Wilson and they say, would you like to be our Democratic candidate for governor? And I'm sure he was flattered by this, and it was a representation of an attempt to try to clean up the situation. So he goes from being the academic to becoming the governor of New Jersey, and then ultimately, of course, the Democratic candidate for presidency in 1912. But he is an academic. He was the only true academic ever to be president. Now, his academic foundation kind of creates one of the characteristics of Wilson I want you to be aware of. And I'm going to call this academic arrogance. I always hold my finger right where I need you to be able to see that. Academic arrogance. And this just means that he always thought he was the smartest person in the room. And I think perhaps he was often the smartest person in the room. But, he definitely thought he was smarter than all the regular politicians. And, that's Perhaps he was very smart, but it was also a manifestation of arrogance, you know, and of course, it didn't make many friends by being it. But clearly, one of the characteristics of Woodrow Wilson was his academic arrogance. He also came from a long line of Presbyterian ministers, and so he had this kind of Christian self-righteousness that I wanted to highlight for you. He always thought that God was on his side. The first or the second George Bush kind of thought in a similar sort of way. But here's someone who had that sort of incredible self-righteousness. And I want you guys to know that I don't necessarily see these as benign personal characteristics. Anyway, the thing that I really want you to know, though, and this becomes one of the more problematic components, Woodrow Wilson was the first Southerner to become president since the Civil War. He was born and raised in Virginia. It's intriguing, though, he was a Southerner, but he could not have come from the South. In the North, the nation would still not allow for a Southern president. So he was born and raised a Southerner, but of course he came from the state of New Jersey in the North, essentially, coming from this academic foundation. Anyway, because he was a Southerner, I'm sure you guys can guess that he was also a racist, a virulent racist. I have to suggest to you that I think that Woodrow Wilson may have been the most racist president in American history. The federal government was actually one agency that was trying to be in some ways assisting of African Americans by employing them in various government jobs. And Wilson was someone who began to try to reverse that trend. He was the first president in American history ever to expect every single job applicant for the federal government to submit a photograph. And the only reason he wanted a photograph was because he wanted to know whether they were white or black. You know, so he was clearly a racist in no uncertain terms. And you know, and that's problematic. It's a very racist time, as I'll tell you just a little bit more about that fairly quickly. But he was intelligent. He was a good orator. He was a good teacher, and he was a progressive. And so he becomes ultimately the second of the great progressive presidents. Now, again, we're not going to deal with him quite so much as Roosevelt, but I do want you to know something about what Woodrow Wilson would do. One of the just the specific areas. And one area which Wilson kind of replicates what Roosevelt had done was he also is going to attempt to tame big business. And he's going to do this by the passage of something called the Clayton Antitrust Act. That was in 1913. The Clayton Antitrust Act was simply a more specific antitrust law. The Sherman Antitrust Act had been very vague, relatively weak. The Clayton Antitrust Act had certain things that were clearly going to be designated as antitrust activities. So, for instance, the Clayton Antitrust Act prohibited the price discrimination. It is against the law for companies to set prices or for any economic entity to set prices. The Clayton Antitrust Act also forbid what they called interlocking directorates. Now, this was a new way of getting around the kind of antitrust situation in that you would have nominally distinct companies, so you could have different companies. But if you looked at the board of directors, they were all the same people. So if they're all the same people on the board of directors of multiple companies, then we have to at least assume that they are functioning in collusion. And to this day, it is against the law for any person to be on the board of directors of one company in their economic area and another company. You can only be on one company. You can be on the board of directors of multiple companies in different economic areas, so that actually that's legal. But this was a way of trying to stop this kind of new attempt to try to create a trust organization. Wilson will also be the foundation of something called the Federal Trade Commission. Federal Trade Commission was established in 1914. And the Federal Trade Commission was simply one of the first of the great watchdog agencies. The idea was simply to watch over the business arena to see if companies were misbehaving or forming themselves into monopolies or doing antitrust or trust activities, violating antitrust laws, and to not wait until the problem got out of hand, but rather to identify it from the very beginning. It is known to us as the FTC. It is still very much active as far as our nation is concerned, overseeing the general activities of big business as far as America is concerned. So these were a couple of things that Wilson would do in terms of taming big business. As I almost always do, I have to mention one other thing that he did, and I didn't do a card for this, but during his administration in 1914, they will implement the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. I should have told you this before. 16th Amendment is kind of a downer after the 14th and 15th, which were basically designed to kind of improve the condition of the American people through civil rights activities. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which we celebrate every April the 15th, not this year though, I guess there's a fairly significant extension, introduced for the first time the federal income tax. This was the first time, and it kind of shows the dynamic of the progressive era, that the progressive era is creating bigger government. And bigger government, of course, is more expensive, and bigger government is going to need more money. Up until that time, the federal government had received most of its revenues from either import duties, tariffs, and things like that, or routinely on the sale of the western lands. That was something the federal government had a lot of, and a way that they could make revenues from it. Now, by this time, of course, I'm telling you the end of the frontier, so not as much land to sell, so they're having to look forward to other sources of revenue, and they implement then for the first time the federal income tax. It wasn't too onerous in those days. It didn't start until you made $4,000, and it was like 2% of income over $4,000. And the average American, average family was making like $1,500 or something like a year. So this is, most Americans are not even being taxed. And if you made over $4,000, of course, it was a 2% tax. Doesn't seem too onerous by our standards. If you made more money, of course, it was graduated, so the more money you made, the more money that you would have to pay. But the primary reason I need to suggest this to you is it shows us the government is getting bigger, and government is getting more expensive, of course, and this will become a major component of development in the 20th century. Now, another area of reform conducted by Woodrow Wilson, and this one will become the one that will create the foundation of the potential identification, was in the area of banking reform. So Wilson will conduct some of the most important banking reform that will occur in American history. And to tell you what he's going to do, I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about the story of American banking. I'm sure this is something you've been waiting all your life to hear. So, quick history of American banking. In the beginning, there was no centralized bank in America. So this is in the very beginning of the Republic. But there was a notion that there should be a centralized bank. And the primary promoter of this was Alexander Hamilton. And I don't know if you guys have seen, the play Hamilton or heard the music of Hamilton, but it's just an indication of the amazing kind of things about this. He's an amazing person, problematic, but very amazing person. He's kind of the founder of the stock exchange. He's the founder of the concept of the central bank, and many other things that are very important in terms of the history of the United States, especially the financial history of the United States. Well, Hamilton was convinced that there needed to be some kind of a central bank to kind of oversee banking in America. He was Secretary of the Treasury under the Washington administration, and he convinced George Washington this was a good idea. So they're going to create something called the Bank of the United States, which was often just known by its acronym BUS, or BUS. So the Bank of the United States was founded under the Washington administration. It was a kind of interesting institution. It was semi-private, semi-public. The government would invest money in it to kind of sustain it, but it also functioned as kind of its own banking apparatus. And the idea was to oversee currency, to oversee banking and banking activities. Now, from the very beginning, it was perceived by many in America as an anti-democratic institution. In other words, it was an institution that would serve the wealthy while not really benefiting the common Americans. Many people didn't like that. And over time, as America became more democratic, the attitude was increasingly hostile to the Bank of the United States. So when we get to the presidency of Andrew Jackson, one of his primary activities was to get rid of the Bank of the United States. And so there was no central bank in America, and this began to be sort of the banking reality as far as America was concerned. Now, the problem was that there were two problems began to evolve, essentially. And one was that American banking and American finances became increasingly controlled by Wall Street banks. And, it's kind of still that way. But in those days, nothing kind of to impinge upon those Wall Street banks. And so they did pretty much what they wanted. And of course, they did not necessarily serve in the public interest. In fact, they routinely didn't. And they served in their own interest, in the interest of their stockholders. And there were many a time when the banks of Wall Street caused some problems in America. And you guys are going to go, oh my God, I can't believe the Wall Street banks would do that. But indeed they did. In 1907, a major kind of crisis occurred. Recession is going to occur, primarily associated with a panic in banking. So this was all done by the Wall Street banks. So American money, American finances were dominated by Wall Street banks, but in a way that benefited Wall Street much more than it benefited the American people. The other major problem was that there was no regulations whatsoever about banking. So banking was just kind of an open field. And my joke is to say that the only thing that you needed, and this is a question I would ask my class, the only thing you needed to be a bank was a sign. If you didn't have a sign, you're not going to be, no one's going to know you're going to be a bank. So no rules, no regulations whatsoever. And this left a very anarchic banking system. There were good banks and there were good bankers, and those were responsible people, but there were many not so good banks and not so good bankers, and this caused a degree of volatility in local banking, runs on banks and things like that. So the American financial system and apparatus was really in relative disarray heading into the beginning of the 20th century. Well, Wilson is going to seek to rectify this by the passage of something called the Federal Reserve Act, which created for us the Federal Reserve System. And this is the very famous Fed that we know even to this day. And that was created in 1913, one of the signal reforms of the Wilson administration and a potential identification as far as History 102 is concerned. The idea was to recreate a central bank for the United States of America. And the bank would have a board of directors that would function out of Washington, D.C., overseeing the general national banking apparatus. It also had 12 district banks scattered across the United States of America. If you look on dollar bills, you can often see indications of what the district banks are. For California, ours is in San Francisco. There are district bank in Seattle, one in Dallas. There's one, almost all the major cities of the East Coast: Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Anyway, these 12 banks will kind of oversee the local banking activity. So what the Federal Reserve was designed to do was begin to try to create a safer and more secure banking system if they possibly could. So the first thing, the Federal Reserve is going to do a number of things that I want to highlight for you. But the first thing that they were going to do was to control everything about this. I hope you guys can see this okay. There you go, okay? Now, I'm pretty sure you guys know that this is a document that's relatively popular. We tend to call it, of course, the dollar bill, but it's technically, if you look at the very top of it, you'll see that it's a Federal Reserve note. And that is an indication of one important component of what the Federal Reserve is going to do, and that is it's going to control everything about money. Money is the purview of the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve will be able to control the printing of money, so they're going to, even, I don't know what they do in terms of the design of it, but make sure how much is being printed. Circulation of money, of course, so how much money is in circulation at any particular time. They can both expand circulation if they wish to. They can contract circulation if they wish to. Everything about money basically comes under the purview of the Federal Reserve. But the most important thing that they are going to control is they're going to control essentially what we call the cost of money, which manifests as the interest rate. This is the thing that we are also aware of that the Federal Reserve is engaged in. They are controlling the interest rate, of course. They didn't quite know what they were doing in the very beginning, and when I get to the Great Depression, I'm going to tell you they made some monumental errors, to say the least. But they used the interest rate essentially as a dial to kind of confront the issues of the economy at a given moment. If inflation gets too high, then they crank the interest rate up to kind of counteract that. That has not been an issue for a very long time. When I was young, when I was in my early adulthood, that was always the issue. Inflation in the 1970s and stuff like that. Now it just really hasn't been an issue for a very long time. When the economy goes down, when we enter into a recession or some kind of problem like that, of course, you lower the interest rate. In the face of the pandemic economic crisis, they have lowered the interest rate a little bit, make money easier for people to get their hands on, essentially. So this became the essential area of activity as far as the Federal Reserve was concerned. It's the thing we hear about all the time. Is the Fed going to raise the interest rate? Is the Fed going to lower the interest rate? These are the things that, of course, economists, people on Wall Street are sort of endlessly interested in one way. So the first thing that the Federal Reserve is going to do is control everything about money. The second thing the Federal Reserve would do is to regulate local banking practices or banking practices in general. So this is to, for the first time ever, set rules of banking. And they could be such things as rules of capitalization, how much money you had to have on hand, rules of loan. And to be honest with you, that's about as far as I can go. I'm sure there's a tremendous number of banking rules, but the Federal Reserve is the essential oversight of banking practices. And indeed, it has an auditing component where they do check on the banks periodically to make sure that they're behaving themselves and doing the right thing. The Federal Reserve was designed essentially to create a safer and more secure banking system. I do believe that that was in general successful, but we all know, of course, that our banking system has been flawed in a variety of different ways. There have been a number of issues through the 20th and into the 21st century, but generally speaking, I do believe that they created at least a somewhat more secure banking system than there had been prior to the Progressive era. Another area which Wilson became involved in was in the area of social reforms. And this is a little bit of an intriguing kind of, juxtapositioning. If you look at the Republicans, there tended not to be a lot of activity in the social reform area. Although when Teddy Roosevelt ran for that second time in 1912, he had a fairly radical social reform agenda. So he looked like he was changing his mind about what he wanted to do. But the Democrats were somewhat more interested in issues associated with social reform. I just want to give you some sense of what's going to happen under the Wilson administration. One of the things they did under the Wilson administration, here we go. Oh, that's not the one I wanted. Well, there are two things I wanted to highlight for you. First, they passed the first 8-hour day law. So this was an attempt to kind of reduce the hours for the average American worker and make life better, reducing the amount of hours. And it just shows you how many hours they were working already. They're probably working 12, 10 hours or something like that, reduced it to 8 hours without any loss of pay, which actually would be, of course, a raise for them. They also instituted the first National Workers' Compensation Act, so to compensate workers who would come into some kind of difficulty through injury or unemployment. So they actually were trying to improve the situation for workers. Now, there's one significant deficiency in both of these acts I wanted to highlight for you, and that was that they would only apply to companies who were federally contracted. So if they had a contract with the federal government, they would have to adhere to the 8-hour day law. They would have to adhere to the workmen's compensation law. Now, at that time, government spending was 2% of GNP, 2%. Now it's about 25% of GNP. In those days, it was about 2%. So that meant that there were very few companies that were actually engaged and contracted to the federal government that would have to abide by these rules. And so I'm not quite sure what they were intending. Perhaps it was simply that this was a model of reform that they hoped that the rest of the private sector would adhere to, though it's pretty clear that that's not what was going to happen. Of the reforms, though, of the social reforms of the Wilson administration, perhaps the most important was the passage of the National Child Labor Act in 1914. So the intent was to confront the reality of child labor in America and to do something about it. At that time, there were about 1.7 million children in the United States of America who were being employed in companies in industry, and often very dangerous jobs. The kids that worked in the coal mines and stuff like that, it's hard to imagine how dangerous that was. And we're looking 1.7 million people between the ages of 8 and 14. So these are little kids that were working. And the idea was to prohibit them from working in these factories, that they would not be able to work in a factory until they were over the age. I don't know if it was the age of 14 or over the age of 14, but some, in their early teens. So to get those little kids essentially out of the factory. This became a major effort on the part of the Wilson administration to try to reform the situation in terms of child labor. Now, the final area of reform that was conducted by the Wilson administration is in the area of political reforms. So just a couple of things that happened here that I want to highlight for you that are, one of them, critically important. But one thing was the passage of the 17th Amendment. Forgive me for not having a card for that, but the 17th Amendment. What it did was it created a national recognition of the direct election of senators. So up until that time, of course, states had already recognized the direct election of senators. Now the national government will do the same thing. But of all of the political reforms of the Wilson administration, the most important by far is the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which will ultimately be ratified in 1920. This, of course, is the amendment that will recognize the right of women to vote. It will simply say that the right of a citizen to vote shall not be denied on account of sex. And this will be, of course, included in the Constitution. I do want you to know that this was implemented under the Wilson administration, but it really isn't a reflection of Woodrow Wilson. In fact, there's a story here, and the story basically is that Wilson is the villain of the story. He's not the hero of the story at all. He is indeed the villain. Now here it goes. As he was running for president, as Woodrow Wilson was running for president, he very much spoke that he would support women's right to vote. He would support that. And the reason he did this, and I hope you guys maybe have a sense of it, is that women are voting. Women are already voting in certain states, like California. Women were voting by this time. So he's appealing to the women's vote to get them to support him, so he will be elected president. Now he gets elected president, but the reality was that he was very sexist, and he didn't really believe that women had any role in politics whatsoever. So although he had promised women that he would support women's right to vote, he had no intention of following up on that promise whatsoever. So he reneged on the promises that he gave to these women. And you can imagine, when you are someone who has supported a politician and they scorn you in this way, they renege on their promises, you're going to want to go after them. And women decided that they needed to go after Woodrow Wilson in a fairly significant way. Feeling betrayed by Wilson, women's groups decided that they would protest against him. So they started to create a visual protest outside of the White House, where the women would just kind of every single day be in front of the White House with their signs and with their placards and things like that, demanding that Woodrow Wilson support women's rights to vote. I won't have to give you kind of an image of this. Most of the women who did this were middle class, upper middle class women. They would dress in their finest clothes, not the finest clothing, but the strolling outdoors in the park kind of clothing. They made their own placards, and they wouldn't make signs in the way that you and I would go out there with paint and do something. They would sometimes sew them, and they were like that T-bar kind of thing that you can make just a nice little, I don't know what you call the thing, cloth sign, and they would embroider the words on the whole thing, and the bottom would be edged like this, and it would have little fringe and everything, beautifully made. They said Wilson sucks, but indeed there's these beautiful kind of embroideries that they would put together. But the women would march up and down in front of the White House. I think they really were the first significant White House visual protest, and just to sort of take it to the White House and let the president know that they were very unhappy with the situation. So every single day, women would be there, and they'd be protesting, they'd be singing songs together. This became part of this continual protest. Well, Wilson did not like this. It's fairly clear that he did not like this. So he basically passed the word to the D.C. police that he wanted these women to be gone. And so pretty soon the police are pulling up with a paddy wagon, and they're loading the women on and arresting them and taking them away. And the first thing that the women's groups did was they simply made sure that there was another woman to take their place. You overwhelm it with numbers, they can't arrest everybody. So every time that there were a group that were arrested, a new group were going to come in and take their place, essentially. And so just arresting the women didn't necessarily have any kind of positive outcome. Well then, and it becomes a Mercury here, the little fog of war kind of situation, but it does seem that the word comes down from on high to let these women know that they shouldn't go back there, that you're going to try to defeat this visual protest. So all of a sudden, the women start getting roughed up and when they're under the control of the police. And we see them coming out with black eyes and broken ribs and stuff like that. So kind of to dissuade them with violence. I have to tell you that in the process of gaining the women's vote, there's a tremendous amount of violence. There's an ugliness to it. Men were not willing to give up their power. And if you see even the misogyny of today against women candidates, it is kind of extraordinary in many ways. That so many men feel so threatened by this, but clearly at that time, men were feeling very threatened by it. I have this image of this massive parade that took place in Washington, D.C. of women trying to promote women's suffrage. So women's groups from all over America came in a huge parade, just one group after another. They would be dressed in certain ways. They'd have sashes, of course, supporting American women's suffrage, etc., from their state and all this kind of stuff. But we have photographs and film of this, what was going on. And as the women are marching, of course, and some of them are singing and making their statements, there's a lot of ugliness coming from the men that were on the side, and sometimes they were throwing things at them, sometimes they were just yelling obscenities at them. And in one particular case that was caught on camera, apparently the women must have talked back to somebody, and there's a couple of guys that walk out and they're just cold cocking women. They're hitting women in the face, basically. It just kind of shows the desperation of these men, and their unwillingness to give up their power. Anyway, as soon as the women are starting to be beaten up by the police, then those that are in the leadership position, realize that they've got to do something more drastic. And one of the great heroines of this moment was a woman by the name of Alice Paul. There's a movie with her, and Hilary Swank plays Alice Paul. So whenever I think of this, I think of Hilary Swank. But Alice Paul decided that the leadership had to put their lives on the line. They couldn't allow just the people to go out and the other women to go and get beaten up. So they went and they got arrested, and they decided to use their arrest, to demonstrate their protest. So they went on a hunger strike. And, when you go on a hunger, it's an interesting form of protest where you're really, damaging yourself, of course, to make your political point. Anyway, this became, of course, a problem for the D.C. police. So they took many of these women who were in the leadership capacity, and they took them to some secluded location in Maryland. And there they began to, force feed them. And the matrons would force feed them. And we have images of the women with their hands tied behind their back and their legs, and they're sitting in a chair, and some woman is trying to jam a hose down their throat, of course, connected to a funnel to forcibly feed these people. Well, somehow the word of these abuses got out into the press, of course, and banner headlines across America. DC police are torturing these women, and all of this ultimately caused Woodrow Wilson to have to cave in to the situation. He simply began to realize that the winds of change were taking place. So forced to, with extreme reluctance, Woodrow Wilson finally does begin to support the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And when that happens, of course, it's at least, it's both houses will approve it. It will be signed by the president also. You probably know that, of course, for the constitutional amendment, that's not enough. It has to be ratified by the states. So it goes to the states, and it's kind of a problem because, the northern states, the western states are all kind of for it. But they needed to have at least one southern state to support them, or it would, you have to have that 2/3 of the states. They needed at least one southern state. For reasons that I'm not exactly clear on, they chose the state of Tennessee. And in some ways I feel sorry for that state because that meant that to Tennessee came all of the proponents, of course, and opponents of the 19th Amendment. They're all going to come in and just bombard the people, the government of the legislature of Tennessee. And so it comes down ultimately to a vote in Tennessee. And it looks like it's going to lose. There's a conservative dynamic going on in Tennessee that seems to, not wanting women to vote. Anyway, they finally do hold the vote, and by one vote, by one person voting aye, the state of Tennessee will ratify the 19th Amendment, and of course it will become the law of the land. There's a little story from this that I always want to share with you guys, and that is that there was this young legislator who had been pretty much outspokenly against the 19th Amendment, and yet when the day to vote, when the vote came on that day, he voted yes, and because he voted yes, everyone wanted to know what the hell had happened here. And so, the story comes from multiple sources, so I'm convinced that it is true. But the story that the young man told was that he had been called by his mama, the night before. And his mama said, son, I'm trying to get all southern on you, I've been living here in the United States all my life, and before I die, I want to vote. So mama told him that, to vote for the 19th Amendment. And all I can say is, thank God for mama, and thank God that this young man was willing to adhere to what mama said. But with the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of 1920, of course, a national recognition of women's rights to vote. It is a political reform under the era of Woodrow Wilson, but the reality is, of course, it was none of his doing. In fact, he's much more the villain of the story than he is going to be the hero of the story. Well, this all brings us to the year 1914. And in the year 1914, things are really going to change. They're not going to just change in America, but they're really going to change throughout the world. And I'm hoping that you can guess what I'm going to tell you is going to happen in 1914 before I tell you. 1, 2, 3. It is the beginning of World War I. And as World War I comes, it's like the global agenda and the national agenda begin to change in a dramatic way. Almost all the major reforms of the Wilson administration took place in the first 2 years of his presidency. They take place in 1913 and 1914. But by the time the war begins, the president is distracted. His focus is moving away. But I think the distraction of the nation, their focus of the nation is moving away also. So we begin to see the end of the progressive era. And it wasn't just the war, it's just a dynamic of momentum. Take a bowling ball and roll it as hard as you can. Oops, and I hit something. Anyway, roll it as far as you possibly can, and no matter how hard you push it, it's going to come to a stop at some point. It's in the nature of life that there is only so much momentum as far as life is concerned, essentially. So by the time we get to 1914, the progressive era is beginning to kind of fade out at that particular moment. And as we begin to, it's going to fade out. There will be continuations associated with it. But as we move to the end of the progressive era, and this is tragic for you, I'm not really going to be done here. What I want to do is offer kind of a final assessment of the progressive era. And I'm just going to take a little break, and I'll get back to that in just a little second, okay?